Hello, this is Eric White. In this screencast, I'm going to do a deep dive discussion of the internals of the OpenXML Power Tools Identity Manager. I've remarked to a friend of mine that I think that the Identity Manager is probably going to be of interest to only 1 or 2% of OpenXML developers. And of those 1 or 2% of OpenXML developers, a subset of those will want to know how the internals of Identity Manager work. To tell you the truth, this is really a screencast for me in a future time when I need to go in and maintain the Identity Manager. There's enough moving parts in there that I know for a fact that I'm not going to be able to remember all of those moving parts. So I'm going to basically do a brain dump of exactly how the Identity Manager is put together. This will be of interest to those developers who are students of document formats and in particular students of OpenXML. It's just interesting to look at the various ways you can accomplish something with OpenXML. So let's get started. As I mentioned, there's a lot to cover in this, and I'm certainly not going to cover all of this information in the most optimal fashion. I'm not that concerned about that with this particular screencast. I am concerned that I want the screencast to actually take less than 1 full hour. We'll see how long it's going to take by the time everything is said and done. What I am concerned about is that I cover enough of this information so that me or others who need to maintain the Identity Manager in the future are able to watch this screencast and then make heads or tails of the code in the Identity Manager. It's really not that complicated, but it helps to understand the basic ideas behind the Identity Manager. First of all, I'm going to discuss the API to the Identity Manager just a bit. I'll open Identity Manager example.cs. The first thing that I want to discuss is this class Identity Manager settings. In this class Identity Manager settings, there are several subtypes. Let's start talking about the subtype custom XML XName. These are the various X names that are used in the custom XML part. Let's go take a look at some of those. Here we're looking at a document that has all of the field codes inserted into the document, and these field codes point to the custom XML part. Just to refresh really quickly, I'll open up the main document part. I'll format the XML in the main document part, and you can see in every paragraph in this main document part, there are these field codes. So we can see there's a field code that starts from here and goes to that location. And we can see it has the value of comments 1, and the 1 here, this is the field code ID in the vernacular of Identity Manager. If you're not familiar with field code ID, go and look at the other screencasts on Identity Manager that introduce the Identity Manager and talk about how it works. That field code ID, that points into the custom XML part. So we have this ID attribute right here, and we have the field code element right here, and here's a content item element, this I element. Let's go back to the code that uses Identity Manager settings, and here we can see all of that. Here's the root element, Identity Manager, and that corresponds to this. This is this X name for that. We have the field code name of F, and that's corresponds to this F element right here, and the X name for the ID is right here, and the item is here, and the item type is here, and the operation is there, and the unique ID for the content item is right here. So these right here are the X names that are used inside of the custom XML part. What this does is this enables you to customize your use of that custom XML part just about any way that you want to. Now, when we go back and look at this custom XML part, we see in this particular case, everything is just a paragraph. And so the item type is para. And then over here, we can see that this paragraph item type, this value is para. So that's where these values come into play when there are more than one content item for a particular paragraph. Each one of those content items is denoted with one of these strings, that these are the value of the T attribute that you'll find. This item type attribute that is specified with this X name right here, the value of that particular attribute will be one of these 6 items. The operation here, this O equals exists, here are the 2 values that are available for an operation. It either exists or it's inserted. And if you go and look at the other screencasts that discuss IdentityManager, you'll see that after the IdentityManager processes a document, at the end of that time, either each item will be an existing item or it will be inserted. And if it's inserted, it won't have a content item ID. It just denotes that that particular content item is inserted into the document, and therefore you're going to have to assign a unique ID or whatever you have to do when you are integrating the data from this document back into your underlying backend system. So there are only 2 operations. There's exists and inserted. And when you are fabricating an OpenXML document that has these field codes in it, and then has the custom XML part that these field codes refer to, when you're initially fabricating it, everything exists. It's only after the IdentityManager gets done processing the document post-editing that some content items are noted as inserted. Let's talk about the other 2 parts of this IdentityManager settings. First is this Lambda expression here, and this is the Lambda expression that given an open word processing document, this gets the appropriate custom XML part that contains the metadata and the content items for that entire document. So this particular example uses a very naive approach. It assumes that there is only one custom XML part in the entire document, and that this one and only one custom XML part contains the metadata for all the content items in the document. If you have a scenario where you have multiple custom XML parts, then you're going to need to make a little bit more elaborate function here. You might have a hard-coded GUID. If you look in the package, for every custom XML part, there is also this props part. Every custom XML part will have one of these props part, and this props part will have this GUID right here. Well, you're perfectly free to assign this GUID to some specific value that you are going to define as the GUID for your custom XML part that is associated with field codes. And that way you could have more than one custom XML part and you're finding just the part that has the GUID that you're interested in. That's the more robust approach if you have more than one instance of a custom XML part in a document. And last is this field code type. Per the vernacular of OpenXML, when we look at the markup for a field code, this is the field code type right here, this comments field code. Comments is one variety of field code. There are also other types of field codes such as dates or so on and so forth. There are many types of field codes. You can refer to the Open XML standard to see the complete enumeration of all the types of field codes. It's actually an interesting exercise to do in and of itself, just to get a sense of the scope of functionality that is encapsulated in field codes. In the OpenXML standard, there's nothing that prevents you from defining your own type of field code. So another way that you could do this is, if you wanted to, you could, for instance, make a new type of field code and call it IM for Identity Manager or something like that. And this would have the advantage of shortening even more the information that is stored in your main document part. And this actually has advantages associated with using the debug custom XML utility that I'm going to show you in just 1 minute. But that's what that particular value is about. This field code type is, it's the field code type that we're using for the field codes that go in the main document part that point to the custom XML part. So you can see that the first thing that this code does that exercises the Identity Manager is it initializes this Identity Manager settings object. After it initializes the Identity Manager settings object, the next thing it does a little housekeeping. It deletes the destination documents and it creates debug versions of each of these documents. And then finally down here, it opens up a file and runs IdentityManager.process identities. And it passes in the open word processing document and it passes in these settings. And that's how those settings get used by the Identity Manager. And then after the Identity Manager runs on that document, it actually also then creates another debug version of each one of these documents. Let me show you real quickly what that's about. I referred to this in the other screencast, but I think that this is appropriate just to give another 30 seconds of attention to. For the main example for the Identity Manager, there are 4 documents that you'll see for each one of the examples. The first is the 01 deleted and inserted paragraph source. In other words, just the plain source. So if you look at this, this is the document exactly as edited by the end user. So here we've deleted a paragraph and inserted it down here. If we were to look at this document in the OpenXML package editor power tool, then what we'll see, of course, is we see that there's the field code here. This field code has comments 1. This comments 1 will point into the custom XML part, and it will be related to this particular element right here in the custom XML part. But to go in and kind of look at things and understand what's going on, that's a little bit cumbersome to do all of that. So let's close this down and let's open up the debug version of the source. And what we see is all that creating a debug version does is it gets that field code, goes into the custom XML part, grabs that XML element that corresponds to that field code, and inserts content right into the main document part. And this content is put in with a smaller font, a 6-point font, and further it's put in with a highlight so that it's easy to see that this is the debug content. And what this does is this lets me go in and look and see, okay, this is the field code that has the field code ID of 1 we see right here, and it has one content item, and this content item has a content item ID of 1, and that's right here. I can, by pressing Alt F9, turn on field codes, and here we can see that field code comments 1, and then what this did is this went into the custom XML part, got that information out of there, and put it into the main document part. This document isn't useful for anything other than debugging purposes, which is why it has the suffix of debug in its name. So we have the source, and then this is the debug version of the source. And here, this is the processed document. I'll turn off field codes, Alt F9. So this then looks exactly like you would expect it to look if you were an end user editing this document, the content was cut and pasted from one place to another. And in this particular case, in the processed version, the revisions have been accepted and the field codes have been updated as appropriate. And if we look at the debugged version of that processed version, then we see that, in fact, the information from the custom XML part is again put into the main document part, so we can see more easily what has gone on. Well, that's enough of that. Let's move on. Before we get into the Identity Manager proper, let's discuss the Identity Manager Field Code Retriever. And what this does, this little module, you pass it a paragraph, you pass it the custom XML element, and you pass it the settings, and it returns an array of all the field codes in that paragraph. So when you initially set up your document for Identity Manager to process it, when you initially create that document, there will be only one field code per paragraph. However, it certainly is possible that the end user could delete the paragraph mark, therefore joining two paragraphs, or maybe delete several paragraph marks and therefore joining n paragraphs. And therefore that new paragraph, that has been joined together with other paragraphs, it will have multiple field codes in it. So what retrieve field codes does is it returns an array of field code info right here. And this retrieve field code recursor, it has to be a recursive method because you might have the situation where a field code is inside a deleted element, or field code's inside an inserted element, or field code is inside of a move from or move to element, and even more to the point, it might be inside a content control or something like that. Because there is this hierarchical aspect to where field codes can be stored in the paragraph, then this particular method is written in a recursive fashion, and therefore it will just work properly. One point about this is you can see that this uses the approach where you have a recursive method that needs to aggregate a whole list of information. And in order to do this, you actually have to pass in this list, and this list gets passed in through the various recursive iterations of this method. This is the only way to have a recursive method that returns lots of information that gets aggregated over various iterations of the recursion. This technique was detailed in this particular screencast in recursive pure functional transforms. So take a look at that screencast. Actually, if you're going to be maintaining this code, you really need to watch every screencast in the screencast series of recursive pure functional transformations. You can find this screencast series at this location. I'm going to talk through this retrieve field code recursor just for a bit. First thing that you'll notice is that it uses the rollup method here, and this rollup method increments and decrements based on the begin and end field codes. And this is there because field codes can be nested. So if you have a field code that starts and then there's an additional field code inside of that, then that field code has to end before the outer one ends. So therefore, in order to aggregate all the information for a particular field code, we have to actually count the begins and make sure that we are on the right end before we quit looking at any particular field code. After it all gets rolled up, it gets zipped together with all of the elements that were rolled up. It gets grouped adjacent according to its depth. And this particular method is written specifically for how I was anticipating field codes would be worked with the Identity Manager, which is mainly we're only interested in the field codes at a depth of 1, and that's why it compares against the key of a level of 1. And one thing also is true is that comments don't have embedded field codes in them. And I also anticipate that if we're using our own custom field code, in other words, the IAM field code type, then that would not have any embedded field codes in them. So that's why comparing and grouping together where the key is equal to 1, that's as appropriate. We just don't want to look at embedded field codes that are 1 level deep. It doesn't matter to us. Those aren't relevant to this particular operation. This then aggregates all of the instructional text of the field code, and it aggregates it together regardless of whether the field code was not deleted or whether it was deleted. The text will have the delete instructional text element name if it was deleted. Otherwise, it will have this instr text if it wasn't deleted. And after we get that text out, it gets trimmed. It gets split to find that space between the field code type and its argument. And it also says here, if we're looking for something and it doesn't just have exactly 2 pieces to it, in other words, comments/name, then this is not one we're interested in. And further, the next thing is that we have to compare whether split of 0 is equal to settings.fieldCodeType. And this is where it compares against that comments field code type, or if you were using IAM, it would be right here where settings.fieldCodeType would be equal to the string of IAM. Then the next thing that it does is it gets that second argument and it does a try parse. And if that try parse doesn't succeed, then this is not one that we're interested in. We want ones that have an integer that is able to be parsed. Then the next thing, here's the string that actually selects the specific field code element out of the custom XML part. And then after selecting that out of the custom XML part, we can get all of the various items out of that field code element in the custom XML part. And this does the projection from those items to the content item info class. And then we finally at the end get an array. So if we look at it up above, we have this field code info, and the field code info has the field code ID, and it has the field code edit status. Was it deleted or inserted or moved from or moved to? It has this notation if the paragraph mark was deleted. It has the rev tracking ID. I think I actually was keeping this, but no longer am actually using it. Here, I'll click Shift F12 there. It gets set, but it never gets used. I had thought at one particular point in time that that was going to be of use to me, but it wasn't. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. It's always more information is better than less information. I had this notation here whether the field code was not at the paragraph beginning. Later on, I determined it doesn't really matter. At the end, we want to end up with 1 field code per paragraph, but we don't really care whether that field code is at the beginning of the paragraph or in the middle of the paragraph. It's not really relevant. We just want to make sure that there's 1 field code per paragraph at the end of this whole process. This custom XML element, this is the element that's in the custom XML part. This list of elements that are the markup elements, these are the elements in the main document part that actually contain those field code elements like the field char start and field char end and so on and so forth. Field char separate. We want those there because what this enables us to do is we can grab these markup elements and just pipe them into .delete, and we can remove that field code from that paragraph super easily using this. Same thing is true with this custom XML element. It gets used in the code to manipulate all of these field codes in the Identity Manager proper. It enables the Identity Manager proper to move those around from paragraph to paragraph in an easier fashion. Finally, here's the containing paragraph, and here is that list of content items that was assembled, that we just saw the code just now to assemble those content items. And down here, we can actually find all of the code to set up all of that filled code info and to set up those content items, that array of content items. And that's probably enough to get you going in understanding what goes on inside of the IdentityManager filled code retriever.cs. I'm going to break this screencast up because it is just too much information for a single screencast. In the next screencast, I'm going to examine the code of the IdentityManager itself.